The plan called for an Allied landing on the Mediterranean French coast between Toulon and Cannes. The whole coastal area, extending from the beaches inland for about 150 miles, was thoroughly softened up for the assault troops. For 3.5 months preceding the invasion date, 5,000 Allied planes dropped some 12,500 tons of bombs on southern France. Early on the morning of August 15, 1944, the mounting air bombardment was supplemented by strong naval fire against the beaches. Soon after dawn on the same morning, the invasion troops prepared for the trip to shore. There was as yet no hint of enemy resistance. Spearheaded by 3 American divisions, supplemented by French units, the U.S. 7th Army made the assault. The troops, many of them veterans of the North African and Italian campaigns, stormed ashore at 8 a.m. and met very light opposition. The landing was executed exactly as planned. The enemy was caught by surprise. The American and French assault units, once ashore, were opposed by only 2 German divisions, spread along the coast, and 8 more farther inland. 7th Army troops won a 15-mile-wide beachhead with comparative ease, and the operation was considered an overwhelming success by Allied field commanders. With the beachhead securely ours, the drive inland was begun without delay. The course of the advance was to be up the valley of the Rhone River. The troops started their drive toward the valley against stiffening resistance. The assault forces were helped materially by members of the French underground, as well as by French villagers encountered along the path of the advance. During the first few days of the campaign, the 7th Army and the Maquis captured more than 10,000 Nazi troops. Throughout the Allied drive in southern France, the Maquis played an especially active and extremely valuable part. The southern France invasion force was to fight its way up the Rhone Valley and then swing eastward into Germany. Having overcome the Nazi defenders along the coast, the 7th Army pushed up the valley on the heels of the main body of German forces racing north toward the German frontier. The pursuit was speeded up in an attempt to trap the fleeing Nazis. The Air Force pounded the exposed German columns steadily. At intervals, the Allied chase was slowed down, as the 7th Army troops were called upon to reduce a pocket of Nazi resistance. The GIs went about the job quickly and efficiently. During the first 2 weeks of the campaign in southern France, thousands of Nazis were killed and 50,000 captured. After 10 days of fighting, the Allied force reached the Rhone River itself at Montelemore, 100 miles from the landing beaches. Here, a last-ditch Nazi stand was quickly beaten down. The advancing Americans trapped one Nazi panzer division and elements of 2 other German divisions. The Germans lost great quantities of materiel in their unsuccessful defense at Montelemore, and additional thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the brief but savage battle. In town after town in their victorious drive up the Rhone Valley, the GIs were greeted with enthusiasm by the overjoyed French townspeople. On September 11th, junction was made between the southern France assault force and American units which had entered France from the Atlantic coast. In the Dijon area, the U.S. 7th and 3rd Army troops made contact, and western France was sealed off. For the final push to the German frontier, the Allies presented a single powerful battle line. Sparking the drive to the east was Patton's 3rd Army.
Patton realized that through speed and determination, each successive advantage is more easily and economically gained than the previous one. Relentless and speedy pursuit is the most profitable action in war.
But the Germans did not simply fall back. The Nazis showed every intention of fighting savagely for every mile of eastern France still in their hands. They used all available mobile equipment in their strong effort to stem the Allied advance along the whole battle line. In a concerted attempt to stabilize their defense, the Nazis fought stubbornly, fully aware that if this stand were unsuccessful, the Allies would, before long, penetrate into Germany itself. In their determined defense, they used their newest, most improved weapons. The Allies hammered continuously at the Nazi line, which had stiffened abruptly. The Allied attack was not quite strong enough. Though handicapped by lengthening supply lines, the Allies kept up their attack on all sections of the front in an all-out drive toward the German frontier. The battle continued for weeks during the early autumn. Elements of Patton's 3rd Army advanced the Allied position a little closer to the German Siegfried Line as they crossed the Meuse River.
We were certain that by continuing an unremitting offensive, we would, in spite of hardship and privation, gain additional advantages over the enemy. Specifically, we were convinced that this policy would result in shortening the war, and therefore in the saving of thousands of Allied lives. Consequently, the fall period was to become a memorable one because of a series of bitterly contested battles, usually conducted under the most trying conditions of weather and terrain. The fighting throughout the front, from Switzerland to the mouth of the Rhine, descended during the late fall months to the dirtiest kind of infantry slugging. Advances were slow and laborious. Gains were ordinarily measured in terms of yards rather than miles. Operations became mainly a matter of endurance, stamina, and courage. Because of depletion of their infantry strength, divisions quickly exhausted themselves in action. Our offensive strength fell off markedly. During the 3 months beginning September 1st, I spent a great portion of my time in travel. I visited commanders in their own headquarters, kept personal touch with problems as they arose, and above all, gained a feel of the troops.
All along the front, Allied planes kept up the attack on Nazi defensive positions. American troops advanced yard by yard in the drive to push the enemy back within his own borders.
The French First Army led the attack on the Belfort Gap and reached it within a week. Its leading troops quickly reached the Rhine. This turned the flank of the German position in the Vosges Mountains and forced a general withdrawal. We were disposed along a line which, beginning in the north on the banks of the Rhine, stretched 500 miles southward to the border of Switzerland. All our divisions were short in infantry replacements, and in total numerical strength of ground forces, the Germans still had a marked advantage. We could, on the average, deploy less than one division to each 10 miles of front. By October 1st, our aggregate strength on the continent was 54 divisions. As a result of the junction with Patch's 7th Army, a considerable number of Germans were trapped in southwestern France. These began to give themselves up by driblets, except in one instance when 20,000 Germans surrendered in a single body.
At Beaugency on September 17th, Nazi General Erich Elster had surrendered 20,000 German troops under his command, marking the end of the Nazi Army of Occupation in southern France. The mass surrender was made without the loss of a single Allied soldier's life. In the north, the Allies decided to drop 3 parachute divisions into German-held Holland in an operation ultimately designed to turn the Nazis' northern flank. The British 1st Airborne Division was to land farthest north, near Arnhem, while the Americans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were dropping a bit farther south. The operation was regarded as a large gamble, but if the Nazi bridges across the Rhine in the north could be seized, the war might be shortened materially. The drops were executed as planned. The first landings by the main airborne forces were made on September 17th and continued for several days following. Initial losses were slight, but there were some. In 2 weeks, more than 20,000 airborne troops had dropped into Holland. Over 13,000 more landed in gliders, which had been towed across the English Channel.
The attack began well, and unquestionably would have been successful, except for the intervention of bad weather. This prevented the adequate reinforcement of the northern spearhead, and resulted finally in the decimation of the British Airborne Division, and only a partial success in the entire operation.
But the Allied airborne troops in Holland accomplished one important task. Of the bridges to be seized, one of the most vital was the Nijmegen Bridge over the Wal, a branch of the Rhine. British and American troops surprised the Nazi force guarding the bridge and captured the valuable prize before the defenders had a chance to set off the demolitions already prepared. Allied ground forces moved safely across and continued the attack.
During the fall months, there was, as originally planned, much to be done operationally. In the north, besides capturing the approaches to Antwerp, it was desirable to make progress toward closing the Rhine, because it was from this region that our heaviest attacks would be launched in the crossing of that river. Winter conditions were now approaching, and Montgomery's advances were made over difficult country. Because of the extended front held by Montgomery's 21st Army Group, it was impossible at the moment to launch further strong offensives in that area.
To the south of the British forces, the Americans also ran into trouble.
The American First Army got involved in the Hürtgen Forest, the scene of one of the most bitterly contested battles of the entire campaign. The enemy had all the advantages of strong defensive country. The weather was abominable, and the German garrison was particularly stubborn.
All along the front in the Aachen sector, as winter drew near, the fighting continued heavy. But in the Hürtgen Forest, the battle was especially tough. After the battle, whenever veterans of the American 4th, 9th, and 28th Divisions referred to hard fighting, they did so in terms of comparison with the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, which they placed at the top of the list. Yankee doggedness had finally won. By mid-December, the Allies had penetrated the outer defenses of the Siegfried Line at several points. American troops were crossing the German frontier in preparation for the final phase of the war in Europe. Only 6 months after the Normandy beaches had been stormed, the battle for Germany was begun.